Hello, Cedar Village. So we have yet again, this is Village Torah. We've got another week in which we have a holiday. That's right, I know, got so many holidays, and normally we reserve this time for discussing the Torah portion, but like I said, we've got a holiday. What holiday is it, you may ask? The answer is it is called Shemini Atzeret. That's right, there's no cool, fancy English translation. It really is just the straight Hebrew Shemini Atzeret. What does Shemini Atzeret mean? We'll get to it in just a moment. But before then, I want to finish up by talking about Sukkot, because we've had Sukkot not only last weekend, but all throughout this week. That's right, we are now finishing up Sukkot and transitioning into really the end of the holiday season with this holiday of Shemini Atzeret. And what's really fascinating is the connection with Sukkot and how it really not only finishes out Sukkot as sort of like a wrapping the bow on top of that present, but actually really the entire cycle of holidays throughout the year. Because actually when you think about it, we start out in the spring with Passover. That kicks things off, gets the ball rolling. That's a week long. We then have then we have 7 weeks later, we have Shavuot. No cool English. Maybe you could translate it as Pentecost, but Shavuot then comes up, and summer is fairly devoid of like really actual holidays. And then of course we get to Rosh Hashanah, that starts things off, then Yom Kippur, as people are well aware of, and then we get to Sukkot, and then we wrap up with what we have this weekend called Shemini Atzeret. So I want to actually go back to talking about Sukkot and then wrap up with talking about Shemini Atzeret. So last week's video, I talked about the central practices of Sukkot. One is, well, it's the actually doing stuff in Sukkot, in huts or booths or tabernacles. And just as we have a sukkah out front, there's also one by the rabbi's house. And in previous years, there would also be one by the garden dining room, but sadly there is none this year. But we still have the one out front. I hope if you had the opportunity to check the one out front at some point this week. We were really blessed with wonderful weather this week, which is really, really fantastic actually. So I wanted to talk a little deeper, because last week I really just talked about the what, right? Talking about the huts, the booths, as well as the 4 arboreal species, right? Lulav, esrog, as well as the hadassim and aravot, the myrtles and the willows. And I'm actually going to start there this week. So I want to dive a little bit more deeply into talking about what these objects are. And, you know, the rabbis weren't happy. Yes, the rabbis were, trust me, the rabbis were more than happy to talk about the details. How do you do this? What are the measurements? And what are the times? The rabbis had a field day with all the details of the practices, but they also wanted to give meaning to these practices. What further meaning or symbolism could be provided? So let's start off. We got to talk, we'll get to the Sukkot, don't worry, but I really want to start off with talking about the 4 arboreal species, right? The 4 tree species we got. So I don't know if you checked out last week's video. Just as a quick refresher, even if you had, but it's been a week, we have 4 species, right? They're all mentioned in Leviticus 23, and the rabbinic explanations that we have these specific 4. We have one, we have one which is the lulav. Ooh. Okay, it's actually not supposed to be spread out. It's more supposed to be like this. It's supposed to be, as we'll see, it's supposed to be straight. We also have the esrog. You can call it either etrog or esrog, and it's really very lemon-like, but not to be confused with a lemon. It's actually significant. If you were to slice it open, and I just may next week just to show it, it's actually a lot stingier on the juice. So it's really not quite the same, but it has a pleasant fragrance, which we'll come back to in just a moment, because it actually does connect to what we're discussing. We also have the myrtles, right? The hadassim and the aravot, the willows. So we have these 4, and we have some really cool, I have a couple of really cool rabbinic statements about these that ascribe meaning to what's going on, some symbolism. So the first of these is talking about how the 4 different species that we combine, that we take together on the holiday of Sukkot, actually represent different people amongst the Jewish people, like the various different, I don't know, not necessarily temperaments, but practices and the way that people behave. So the first one they talk about is the esrog, right? The etrog, and they say this one, which has both
smell as well as taste. So if you were to actually slice it open, you can use it for juice. A lot of people like to collect a bunch of esrogim from their neighbors and then create a jam or a jelly. So this has both taste as well as a pleasant smell, has both. And they say, well, these are similar. So they say, well, this is just like those who both study Torah, who are both involved in the study of the Jewish tradition and sharing of it, as well as those who actually practice, who do mitzvot, who do the commandments, who do what the various Jewish activities are. So that's one. The next is the lulav, the palm branch. And they say, well, it has taste, right? Because what else grows on a palm tree? Dates. And dates are delicious. So those have taste, but they don't really have smell. Dates nor the palm branches are necessarily a pleasant or fragrant smelling thing. And so they say, those who only have Torah study, they have good taste, right? You eat the dates, those taste good. They actually study the Torah, but they don't do much of the actual mitzvot, the actual commandments. Now, we also have the myrtle, right? So we have the myrtle here, and these, they have a pleasant smell, but they don't have a good taste. So those are compared to those who complete and actually do the mitzvot, who do the Jewish practices, but they don't study Torah. They do one thing, but they don't do the other thing. And finally, we get to the willow, which is looking a little dried up, getting close to the end of Sukkot. These don't have smell, and you wouldn't eat them either. So those are Jews who neither practice the commandments nor study Torah. So those are devoid of either. But God says, according to this midrash, this rabbinic midrash, this kind of narrative expansion, this rabbinic meaning making, the symbolism, and God says, bind them all together and let them atone one for the other, which is doubly interesting, right? So one is this theological notion that of combining all sorts of Jews of various levels of practicing, from the Jews who practice the most sort of maximal practice of Jewish lifestyle to those to the most minimal of Jewish lifestyles, are really devoid of a Jewish living, and then those who, on various aspects within, who study, maybe not practice, and practice not study, and various points in between. Nevertheless, they all come together. But this is the really fascinating aspect, is that they are mechaprim elu al elu, that they atone one for the other, that they're somehow all combined, that they're all somehow responsible and even better, helpful for the other. That were it not for their atoning for each other and helping each other, that somehow they would, somehow have some sort of sense of sinning maybe. It's a little unclear from that midrash exactly the mechanics of how that works, but somehow it's ultimately beneficial for the entire whole of the Jewish people that they all come together. So it's a really fascinating rabbinic meaning making going on there with that midrash. Totally different one. Okay, and again, this one, just like the last one, comes, if anybody's keeping score out there, it comes from Leviticus Rabbah or Vayikra Rabbah. So this one is ascribed to Rabbi Mani. I'm not really sure when he lived. I'm guessing 4th century of the Common Era. He says, he quotes this verse from Psalms, "All my bones shall say, Lord, who is like you." So Rabbi Mani says, the verse was only stated for the sake of this, the 4 species. And so what does that mean? Well, actually, Rabbi Mani does something clever here. What he does is compare each of these 4 different arboreal species to aspects of the human body. So he says the lulav, right? It has, and I don't know if you can tell, I don't know if you can see, but it actually has a hard backbone here. And this, he says, is like the spine, is a human spine, right? Like someone's spine. It stands upright, it's tall, right? It's like someone's spine. The myrtle is similar to the eye. Now this is, I don't know if you can see this, I'll try to bring it closely. It actually has a similar shape as someone's eye. We have the willow, and you can't really tell, it's a little desiccated at this point. This is similar to the mouth, right? Trust me, it works, okay? It works. And finally, we have the etrog, which is similar to the heart. Very interesting. Very, boom, 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 right? Similar to the heart. So these 4 species, right? Heart, we have spine, mouth,
eyes, and heart. So that's really fascinating. And then he goes back that all my bones shall say. So it's a really cute rabbinic piece going on of how all those are somehow. It's an interesting connection with the book of Psalms and what David was saying as far as all my bones shall praise, all my body parts shall praise. So these four things that we take together are somehow symbolic of the human body, and that we take them and help. And this is what's really clever about what Rabbi Imani does, is that they help us praise God. Really, really fascinating. Okay. Talked about the four species. Even though I enjoyed holding this lulav, who knows, maybe I'll come back to this and just use it as a nice little prop. But I actually want to talk about Sukkot. I'm going to transition into the actual huts, the actual Sukkot. Actually, what does that even mean? Okay, so last week I talked about the verse from Leviticus 23, that there are certain commandments, certain mitzvot in the Torah that we're supposed to do, and we have no reason ascribed to them. Why do we do this? Why do we do that? Oftentimes we just don't know. There's no reason given. It's really funny, because when it comes to the holiday of Sukkot, a very clear reason is given as to why the Jewish people should do the practice of dwelling in huts and dwelling in booths during this time. What's the reason? God says, because I caused so that the Bnei Israel, the Jewish people, should know that I caused the Jewish people to dwell in huts back when they were in the desert. So it's a way for us to remember this is what our ancestors did, right? But the question is, what does this mean when God says, I caused the Jewish people to dwell in huts? What does that mean? So there's actually a really fascinating disagreement that breaks out in the Talmud. There's two rabbis, two early 2nd century rabbis, Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva, and they have totally different opinions on this. So one is Rabbi Eliezer, according to the Babylonian Talmud, Sukkot 11b, Rabbi Eliezer said, when God said huts, the Sukkot, it doesn't actually mean Sukkot, not physical things. No. These were the clouds of glory that are being described in the Torah that guided the Jewish people along the way. And this is according to Rabbi Eliezer, this is what he means. God didn't actually make physical huts for the Jewish people in which to live. No, that's not possible. But he does have the Ananei Kavod, which are protective. Rabbi Akiva says, nope, these were actual Sukkot. These were real, that God built. I don't know if there's trees in the desert, but somehow there were huts constructed, and God was able to use these physical booths, these physical huts, these physical Sukkot to house the Jewish people in their various encampments along the way in the desert for 4 decades. So very fascinating. I will say there's no clear final decision. Yes, we believe what Rabbi Eliezer says, or we believe what Rabbi Akiva says. These two opinions on how do we understand this verse remain within our tradition, that it could be actual physical Sukkot, actual physical huts, that we take what God told us at literal face value, or we go with Rabbi Eliezer's position, which is, no, God doesn't work that way. That's not how God works. God doesn't actually build physical Sukkot for us. He not necessarily in the physical in that way, sort of more metaphysical with those clouds of glory, which are pretty special as they are. One really fascinating text that I stumbled upon in the course of preparing this session is which actually discusses these clouds of glory, because we often see in the Torah it talks about the clouds of glory this, clouds of glory that. Really fascinating rabbinic text for anybody out there keeping track. It's in Tosefta Sota in the early 4th chapter. So that it actually says there were 7. Right? And where does that even come from? But it's really clever. It says there were 7 clouds of glory in the desert. 1 to their right, 1 to their left, 1 in front of them, 1 behind them, 1 above their heads, and 1 for the divine presence, the Shekhinah, amongst them. And the pillar of cloud would go in front of them, and killing snakes and scorpions and burn thorny bushes, would lower for them the high road and raise the low road and make the path straight. This is really fascinating, Midrash. It's really fascinating, sort of like a rabbinic narrative expansion of thinking. I mean, if you think about it, it's really these are some serious protective, I don't know, I'm going to say
physical escort or like, if you're on your way, this is some serious insurance, some serious protection. This is as opposed to just maybe there's a couple of clouds, right? 7, right? All encompassing, all around you. Really clever. I think that's a really, to be honest, before this class, I really hadn't come across that, which was really fascinating. Okay. All right. We have talked so far about some rabbinic meaning making, some rabbinic symbolism of what we discussed last week as far as the central practices on Sukkot, dwelling in Sukkot, as well as taking of the 4 species. I want to talk about something that I don't think it's a lot of discussion when it comes to the holiday of Sukkot, which is sacrifices. And before you fall asleep on me, get this. I'm super fascinated by this. It's something that I'm pretty sure most everybody, 99.5% of Jews, whoever have attended synagogue and listened to the Torah reading, this is definitely a part that people glaze over. I'll be honest, most of the time I never cared for it. But this past year, it's been really fascinating to read Numbers 28 and chapters 28 and 29 that talks about the various sacrifices throughout the year. Yep, it's that boring, but this is actually where it gets fascinating. Okay, most of the year, there's actually in Numbers chapters 28 and 29, it talks about how many sacrifices to offer. There's sacrifices on a daily basis, a very minimal amount. There's a little bit more on Shabbat. Then there's more on new moons, as well as the various holidays, whether that's Passover, whether that's Shavuot, whether that's Rosh Hashanah, whether that's Yom Kippur. These all there's a pretty standard set amount of offerings. And when I talk about offerings, I'm talking about animals. So that's mainly, we're talking some bulls, let's see, a little bit, there's bulls, I want to say goats, bulls, goats, lambs, and there's probably something else, but you got your meat, right? You got your animal meat that you're offering up, as well as they all have libations that go with them, which is just wine. There's maybe in Numbers chapter 28, it could have been beer that was supposed to have been offered up on the altar, but we'll just stick with wine as being the libation. And then also some oil we're talking about olive oil that went along with it, and maybe some flour. Okay, so this is what's being sacrificed. And the oil and the wine are in correspondence, quantitatively correspond with how many animals, how much fat, how much meat is being offered up on the altar on these different days. Now, as I mentioned, all these different holidays are pretty much the same amount. Sukkot, vastly, far, like it's crazy how much more pounds of meat are being offered up, and also for that man, how many gallons of wine are being dumped out for Sukkot versus other holidays in sacrifice. So it's such a vast number. We have Sukkot, and then here's what's really a sharp contradistinction, right? We have the 7 days of Sukkot, and then we have, I mentioned earlier, Shemini Atzeret, right? That's what we've got coming up this weekend. So there's a nice tie-in, which is that Shemini Atzeret's sacrifices are actually pretty much just like all the other holidays of the year, having nothing to do with Sukkot. It's really just like it's just a regular holiday. That's really what it is. It's not like Sukkot, right? It happens to be juxtaposed temporally, right? It's coming right on the heels of Sukkot, and yet it retains its own distinct character to it. So I mentioned that there's a lot. I'm not going to go into exactly quantitatively how much is being offered up, but if you add them all up, how many bulls are being offered? It's a massive amount for this week. There are 70. Okay, there are 70 bulls being offered. The rabbis couldn't let that number alone. That's such a significant and deeply intriguingly fascinating number. So we have also in the Babylonian Talmud, Rabbi Elazar says in Babylonian Talmud, Sukkot 55b, Rabbi Elazar says, these 70 calves got to correspond to something. I mean, this is a pretty significant number. Actually, they correspond to the 70 nations of the world. And so in rabbinic thinking that there are 70 nations of the world, there might actually be 93 or 152 or 278. It doesn't really matter ultimately how many are actually around. In the rabbinic thinking, there's 70, right? There's always ultimately 70, and even if you have 93, well, these 5 ultimately sprang from this nation, and these came from that nation. Whatever it is, 70. So according to Rabbi Elazar, who's a 3rd century rabbi, he says these 70 bulls that are being offered up throughout the entirety of the holiday of Sukkot correspond to the 70 nations of the world. But then, why is there only one being offered up on Shemini Atzeret? Well, he says this corresponds to the singular nation, meaning Israel, the Jewish people. And he says this is analogous. So he makes a parable. He's like, this is a parable. This is comparable to a human king who says to his servants, make for me a grand feast. Let's have a big party, right? Let's have a big feast. But on the last day, right? Let's have it multiple days, huge feast. But on the last day, he says to his beloved, just make me a small meal that I may take pleasure in just you, right? So there's this, we go from a more universalistic approach for this entire week and then go, boom, very particularistic for this one last day of Shemini Atzeret, which is an interesting, very interesting way of rabbinic meaning making out of all these offerings of thinking about the contrast from Sukkot to Shemini Atzeret. And then one of the really interesting things right on the heels of this, on the exact same page in the Babylonian Talmud, Rabbi Yochanan, also a 3rd century rabbi, says, well, you know, and I think he's definitely of the same mind as Rabbi Elazar, that these 70 bulls correspond to the 70 nations of the world. And he says, woe to the nations of the world, because they lost something and they don't even know what they lost. Because when the temple was still standing, these 70 bulls that correspond to the 70 nations of the world atoned for them. This accomplished atonement for the entire world throughout these 7 days of Sukkot. But now that the temple lays in ruins and is destroyed, and we can no longer offer these bulls throughout the holiday of Sukkot and can no longer offer atonement for them, it's their loss that the temple has been destroyed by a foreign nation. So that's such a deeply fascinating rabbinic way of thinking about these 70 bulls, and it's also funny that the rabbis would ascribe a universalistic approach, a more general approach to the holiday of Sukkot, which, as we saw at the beginning in the book of Leviticus, chapter 23, Sukkot is really about this special relationship with God and the Jewish people, and it's a way for us to commemorate our time in the desert and God's protecting of us in a sheltering capacity. Okay, I promised you that I would actually talk about the transition to Shemini Atzeret. I did mention this midrash from Rabbi Elazar, who talks about this contradistinction, this juxtaposition from Sukkot moving to Shemini Atzeret. So what does Shemini Atzeret mean, right? This is the holiday that we've got this weekend. What is it? So Shemini means 8th. It's like the number 8, Shemona, but now it's Shemini, okay? So that's the 8th. And then Atzeret. What is Atzeret? Great question. What is Atzeret? So it could come from Otzer, right? Otzar, which is collection or gathering, because like I mentioned before, the holiday of Sukkot is a fall harvest festival. So you are gathering in and you're storing up for winter, right? So you're gathering. This is the celebration of gathering, getting ready for the winter. We're done with all the harvest. We're done with all that working, and now we're just going to sit back, relax, and enjoy. That could be one way of thinking about it. Another is to think about it as like atzar, like stopping, right? What is the stopping of? Well, we're done with the holidays. We're done. Not just Sukkot. Yes, we're done. This is the grand finale. This is the grand finale of Sukkot. But I think it's the grand finale of the entire fall holiday season, and even more broadly in a more macro sense, taking a bird's eye perspective of all the holidays of the year. This is it. This is the grand finale. We started with Passover in the spring, went to Shavuot, then went to Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, Shemini Atzeret. This is the grand finale. Wrap it up, tie it with a bow, and we are done for the year with holidays. So that's Shemini Atzeret. There's no special symbols or other things associated with the holiday. It's really just like a totally normal holiday, just it's there. There is a practice in the diaspora, not in the land of Israel, but in the diaspora outside of the land of Israel, a practice for some people to also eat or sleep or drink inside of their sukkah, because it may still be Sukkot. It's a nice practice. It's a nice custom. There's no obligation. And if one were to eat, drink, or sleep in the sukkah, there is no blessing of Asher Kiddushanu b'mitzvah v'tzivanu l'shev b'sukkah on the holiday of Shemini Atzeret. But it's a really nice, I enjoy Shemini Atzeret. It's a nice way of, calming things down and settling in. That having been said, I do have to put a little footnote, an asterisk, and qualify that, which is to say, I don't know exactly. I'm not exactly a great historian. I would say 5-6 centuries ago, it developed on the second day. Okay, so this is only in the diaspora, not in the land of Israel, but in the diaspora on the second day of Shemini Atzeret. What happened? They said, you know what? Let's make something special. Let's carve something special. The first day we'll just call it Shemini Atzeret still, right? But the second day, we're going to carve it out and make it something special. That something special is Simchat Torah, or Simchas Torah. Right, so Simchas Torah or Simchat Torah, which literally means a rejoicing of the Torah, is an opportunity to celebrate the conclusion, the finale of the annual reading cycle of the Torah. We're going to celebrate the wrapping of it up, finishing up, and getting ready for the following Shabbat to start. Once again, the very, very beginning of the book of Genesis and Bereshit. And it's become a day of lots of dancing, lots of joy, lots of drinking. It's quite the day. Of course, this year is going to be quite different, as a lot of synagogues are not going to be in person, and even some who will still be meeting in person won't be dancing, and certainly not with Torah. So it's going to be a really interesting Simchas Torah around the world this year, especially, it's going to be really interesting. But in the meantime, Shemini Atzeret ultimately is really just fundamentally about wrapping up the year, the holiday, the whole entire annual holiday cycle. So I hope this was helpful in providing not only a deeper understanding into the various rabbinic meaning making and symbolism around the holiday of Sukkot that we've just been celebrating for this past week, as far as thinking about the huts, thinking about the Sukkot, thinking also about the Arba Minim, as well as, I just wanted to grab it because it smells nice, the etrog and the other 3 species with the lulav, and also thinking about the holiday of Sukkot and thinking about universality versus particularity, or actually I should say in tandem with both universality and particularity, and also thinking about Shemini Atzeret, wrapping up, putting a nice bow on top of our holiday package, our annual, what we got throughout the year. So I want to say thank you so much for watching, and I want to wish you not only a Shabbat Shalom, but also a Chag Sameach. Thank you so much.